This is going to be a tempestuous voyage. First though, an unashamed plug. This story of an undeclared war between experts is an analysis of the wider implications of evidence presented in my YouTube series, The Vinland Map, Hoaxes Within Hoaxes. If you haven't already seen at least the first couple of episodes, set aside some time after this symposium is over. Next, a basic principle. History is a science which just happens to have an evidence problem. Even where we have 100% evidence of physical events, we cannot have any certain knowledge of the associated mental events. However, a couple of proven falsehoods can give us more reliable information about mental events than 1,000 proven truths. People often lie, even to themselves. In 1854, the great scientist Michael Faraday advised that any researcher must, ultimately, prove a sharper critic to himself than anyone else can be. And in particular that, the force of the temptation which urges us to seek for such evidence and appearances as are in favour of our desires, and to disregard those which oppose them, is wonderfully great. Faraday's point was very clearly illustrated by an early 20th century hoax, Piltdown Man, which succeeded for years because, as a later director of the British Museum put it, a myth was created by a clever satisfaction of a specific scientific expectation. The creators and promoters of the Vinland Map followed a similar approach, but the desire they exploited most effectively was the desire for status. Today I shall be suggesting, even more strongly than in my earlier works, that the creation of the Vinland Map was not intended to have the results we see today, but it turned out to be a perfect MacGuffin for what I call Wikispiracy, a chain of mutually beneficial transactions which tend to rely on participants subconsciously accepting that their optimal strategy is not to ask too many awkward questions. A strategy which most of us, by the way, adopt whenever we go shopping. YouTube educator and blogger Toby Hendy has recently discussed the concept of the expected expert, the person who, in a given situation, is deemed, justifiably or otherwise, to be the best available source of skill or information. She acknowledged that she usually enjoyed situations where she was the expected expert, and the relevance of that concept to the Vinland Map is that anybody chosen for a particular task can regard themselves as expected experts and feel well disposed towards whoever has chosen them. The antiquarian trade differs from ordinary merchant activity because every item is unique, so the trader has to gain stability by forming long-term, mutually beneficial relationships with suppliers and buyers. Lawrence Whitten, son of an insurance agent, never made professional use of the music degree he was awarded by Yale in 1951. The most important thing he had gained from his years of study was a network of relationships among the university staff, and within months of graduation he set himself up nearby as a dealer in old books and manuscripts. Years after his death, Whitten was described in the newsletter of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America as one of the most respected and respectable antiquarian booksellers the world has ever produced. Maybe he was, but as a specialist in the law on international cultural theft later noted, there are reputable dealers, but that's irrelevant, since their reputations are only good until you've discovered a crime they've committed. What we need are honest dealers. Enzo Ferraioli de Ri, a fascist gentleman who moved from his Italian homeland to Spain after the Second World War, provides a spectacular example of the reputation versus honesty equation. He used his upper-class background to set himself up as a buyer and seller of items which did not exactly belong to the people from whom he acquired them, moving stolen items to nations where they could safely be sold to buyers in yet other nations, particularly the United States, where both institutions and private collectors were taking advantage of Europe's economic desperation after the Second World War. This was Vikispiracy in action. Buyers needed to be able to state that they had bought items in good faith, which would obviously be impossible if they forced suppliers to reveal the true source of the merchandise. So, expert dishonest dealers would provide plausible false provenances or background stories. In the case of the Historia Tartarorum, an apparently unique manuscript giving new information about a famous medieval Christian expedition across the whole breadth of what by the 1950s had become the communist world, appended to a fairly commonplace medieval encyclopedia volume stolen from the Archdiocese of Zaragoza in Spain, the background story began with the creation of a sketchy map. That Vinland map was probably drawn by a self-employed calligrapher on a no-questions-asked cash payment basis, using text and source maps provided by Ferraioli. Here's a good example of what a good calligrapher can produce in a couple of weeks. So, the drawing of the Vinland map should only have taken a few days. To compile the text, Ferraioli used very simple shortcuts, such as finding little-used books on relevant topics, from which he selected obscure facts for inclusion on the map. Some of those apparent facts were really mistakes by the authors, but considerable expertise would be needed to show that the mistakes were not due to the authors having had a private viewing of the ostensibly older Vinland map. Which brings us back at last to expected experts. When fun-loving London dealer Irving Davis brought Ferraioli with the Historia/Vinland map volume to the British Museum in summer 1957, it seems he had, based on long acquaintance with museum staff, selected two expected experts who would be likely to find it alluring: R.A. Skelton and George Painter. But Ferraioli, paradoxically, needed them to express both enthusiasm and serious doubt. That need stemmed from a necessary quirk of the American rules for tax deductions in respect of charitable donations, which require a valuation of physical items at the time of donation. Needless to say, an antiquity which arouses suspicion about its authenticity will be relatively cheap to buy, and if that suspicion can be eliminated by further research before donation, the tax deduction can be based on a much higher valuation. I'm pretty sure Ferraioli intended the map to be revealed as a forgery once it was exposed to the great resources of an American academic institution, while the main part of the encyclopedia volume, miraculously reaching the same destination by a different route, would authenticate the genuine Historia Tartarorum. Back in Europe, Ferraioli would then claim to investigate and find that the map had been made as a joke by somebody whose identity he preferred not to reveal. As proof of this, he could, for example, exhibit the image which had been projected in random sections to create the map outline, identify the modern maps from which Greenland, Iceland and Japan had been copied, perhaps even comment on the ink experiments which had created the dirt in the map's central fold. Lawrence Whitton, as a smart Vikispirator, would know nothing beyond what he needed to know, but he must have been seriously impressed by the way Ferraioli and Davis arranged for that encyclopedia volume with its beautiful wormholes to reach Thomas Marston, one of his best friends within Yale University Library. That was almost certainly based on nothing more than a casual chat in a cafe in Milan. I think it was Whitton who worked out how to engage the next Vikispirator, the person who would buy the manuscripts and donate them to Yale in a scheme which would keep the map well clear of Yale's great resources, while raising the tax deduction value from the $10,000 or so which might have been expected for the authenticated Historia Tartarorum to a figure in the high hundreds of thousands. With great price hikes comes great responsibility, so Whitton performed Vikispiratorial due diligence. First, he prepared a detailed report on the documents, which both minimised the need for further research during the authentication process and marked him as the source of any misleading information. Second, he lied repeatedly about visits to the non-existent private library which had supposedly owned the Historia Tartarorum. The more significant his lies, the more effective would be his confession in exonerating the donor if the scheme failed. The donor being a Yale alumnus like Witten, it would be easy to persuade him to combine the formal authentication with the production of a book by Yale University Press. Witten must also have been indirectly responsible for nominating R.A. Skelton as the principal expected expert and Tom Marston as translator. A few years earlier, Skelton had written a series of journal articles on explorers' maps, which probably influenced Irving Davis' decision to approach him in 1957. In 1958, an expanded version of the articles had been published on both sides of the Atlantic as a heavily illustrated but serious book, marking him as possibly the world's greatest expert on the topic. However, it was precisely his vast knowledge of the corpus of explorers' maps which made him most vulnerable, because he understood better than almost anybody else the sheer stylistic variety of early hand-drawn world maps, and was thus inclined to give unexpected revelations the benefit of the doubt. It's unclear who suggested that Skelton and his colleagues, apart from project manager Alexander Vita, should be diverted from understanding that their prestigious Yale University Press book was just a byproduct of the vital text authentication. But even with the little information publicly available, it is clear that, in typical Wikispiracy fashion, the donor, Paul Mellon, was active in pursuing a scheme which would benefit him. If Witten had even informally suggested the most dubious aspects of the plan, such as the need to keep the book project so secret that even experts at Yale could not be consulted, so much the better for Mellon if hard questions were asked. Witten's detailed report and further helpful interventions while the book was being written influenced both Skelton and Tom Marston, who ended up with the consolation prize of describing the physical characteristics of the documents when his inadequate Latin led to George Painter stepping in as translator. I wonder whether somebody else connected with Yale was able to influence the decision to celebrate Leif Erikson Day, a cheeky 3 days before Columbus Day. Certainly both Yale University Press, next in the Wikispiracy daisy chain, and Paul Mellon as their sponsor were very happy to take advantage of the new celebration. Painter and Skelton's work was genuinely scholarly and should have consigned the book to the academic specialist market, but the impact of its launch made it a bestseller. As a bonus, the furor generated by fans of Columbus conveniently hid the instant controversy among experts who were getting their first sight of the Vinland map on launch day via the book's enhanced photographs. One of the most subtly impressive aspects of the Vinland map Wikispiracy is the way the impact of expert doubts was minimised. Skelton was a very conscientious scholar who had, in his contribution to the Yale book, taken care not to avoid controversial issues, but rather to deal with them to the best of his abilities. After the book was launched, he engaged in correspondence relating to reviews in academic journals and arrived at the conclusion that the map was either genuine or a 20th century forgery, not from any date in between. In February 1966, he showed enlarged images of writing from the 3 linked manuscripts to paleographers at the Society of Antiquaries. They confirmed that Marston, influenced by Witten, was wrong to claim that the same person had written the text of the map as the other documents. The debate was dragged back to America by involving the Smithsonian in hosting a Vinland Map conference that autumn. Lawrence Witten boldly attended and, even more boldly, doubled down on his various lies. Nevertheless, various uncomfortable truths emerged. One matter of particular concern was the revelation that not a single trained scientist had studied the map in all the years since it had first come to light. In response, Skelton undertook to have the documents examined by his scientific colleagues at the British Museum when they were displayed in London early in 1967, and the Smithsonian chose analytical specialist Jacqueline Ollin to keep a lookout for techniques which might shed new light on the documents. The British Museum scientists were utterly baffled by the map's oddness and unable to provide clear answers, so they concluded their report with a series of questions, which Yale undertook to have answered by ultra-microanalysis at the renowned McCrone lab in Chicago. What happened next, or rather what did not happen, is one of the murkiest episodes in the Vinland Map story. Over the next 4 years, effectively the only information published about the Vinland Map came from Jacqueline Ollin, who denounced as erroneous news reports based on a remark by George Painter that the British Museum scientific study had found the map ink was not an iron gall formulation. The scientists' own report was delayed until the McCrone analyses were completed, but the McCrone analyses themselves were delayed until a new piece of equipment became available. And meanwhile, the 1966 conference report was also delayed for reasons nobody has ever even attempted to explain. Not until over 6 years after the donation of the map to Yale did information start flowing again. First the conference report in 1971, then, simultaneously in 1974, the McCrone and British Museum reports, which were, oddly, published in a British journal so that Americans learned of their damning impact only through Yale press releases. What none of the public reports revealed was Lawrence Whitten's confession to Yale of his major lies and Paul Mellon's decision not to demand repayment of the money he had spent. As he had bought the Vinland map from Whitten in good faith and had it independently authenticated, its tax deduction status could not be retrospectively annulled. Jacqueline Ollin, though, took her scientific brief very seriously and turned to her Smithsonian colleague Kenneth Toe for a second opinion. Sure enough, he found flaws in the McCrone report, which had suffered from lax quality control after the initial bombshell discovery that the map ink contained modern industrially processed anatase pigment. Dr. Toe, like Skelton, combined wide knowledge with an inquiring and conscientious mind. The anatase was definitely in the ink, so he visited one of America's leading manufacturers of anatase pigment to inquire about their pre-1957 products, and even took the trouble to examine the map microscopically with Mrs. Ollin at Yale, pointing out the clear separation of the yellow and black components of the ink on the west coast of Great Britain. His expertise was able to dismiss the possibility that the damning anatase only seemed industrially processed and had come from natural clay, because the ink did not contain clay minerals in significant quantities. Also, he could later dismiss the possibility that the anatase had come from natural riverbed sand, because anatase in sand does not look as if it might be industrially processed. Dr. Toe and Mrs. Ollin were also among the first people outside Yale to learn of Whitten's confession, which he took more seriously than she did. In fact, even in 2018, more than half a century after accepting the Smithsonian's watching brief and 2 decades after retirement, she remains apparently unconvinced that the Vinland map is a fake, and she has been somewhere in the background of almost every professional attempt to challenge that finding. The most famous of these was the reanalysis in 1985 by the new technique of particle-induced X-ray emission, PIXI, at the University of California, Davis, where the team appears to have been so obsessed with quality control by following formal protocols that its various experts were inhibited from applying their expertise to recognise its multiple errors. For example, when the team reported their 1982 analyses of the inks used to print Johannes Gutenberg's Bibles, they specified that for documents their technique required, the ability to analyse a known amount of ink plus paper and then subtract the paper content. This cannot be done if the excitation covers an unknown ratio of ink to paper. Thus, one requires excitation narrower than the inked letters. Yet when they analysed the Vinland Map ink, although they did make the particle beam narrower than they had for the Bibles, they seemed to forget the scientific reason why they needed to do so, and did not make it narrow enough to excite just an area of the ink line without any surrounding blank parchment. Writing about this project in 2014, the team leader, Professor Thomas Cahill, recalled that shortcomings in McCrone's analyses and reporting made his conclusions highly suspect to the Smithsonian, which asked us to do the analyses. That wording is interesting because it implies that when Mrs. Olin approached the Pixie team, she may have told them explicitly that she considered the McCrone findings highly suspect. That, I suggest, is exactly the wrong thing to do when commissioning research to check an earlier scientific study. And given Mrs. Olin's subsequent history of backing studies which came to erroneous and even silly conclusions, I suspect that she may have managed to plant biases in the minds of every team she chose to work with. For example, the radiocarbon dating with which she was involved in 1995 triumphantly announced, after another of the famous Vinland Map 6-year delays, that the date of the map parchment exactly matched that of the companion documents, which came as no surprise to David Baines Cope of the 1967 British Museum team, who had predicted exactly that. He had even warned in 1983, in direct response to the development of the small sample dating technique, that its only use in detection of document forgeries would be to reveal isotopes generated by modern nuclear testing, somehow incorporated into supposedly old materials. When the 1995 dating team discovered that the Vinland map was thoroughly soaked with a substance containing such modern radiocarbon, they simply washed it out and carried on. That may, however, have had a major influence on the other big 1995 project, the 30th anniversary augmented edition of the 1965 book from enthusiastic Vicky Spiriters, Yale University Press, again sponsored by Paul Mellon, which was delayed and eventually launched at a so-called conference on 10th February 1996. There, a press release was issued explicitly dismissing the McCrone reports as erroneous and proclaiming that examination of new scientific evidence re-establishes the map. But it turned out that the only real scientific evidence promoted in the book and at the conference was the decade-old Pixie analysis. I think the new scientific evidence was actually intended to be the radiocarbon dating, but there was no acceptable way to hide the problem with the modern radiocarbon. So instead, the dating was presented later in 1996 at a specialist conference in Finland, probably just to fulfil grant conditions. For safety, the results were even omitted from the published report of that event. Mrs. Olin's own continuing insistence that the map's ink could, contrary to all analyses, be an iron gall formulation became a source of genuine irritation to other previously uninvolved scientists when she repeated it for the umpteenth time in 2003, shortly after the dating results had been made public in a revelation almost certainly timed to coincide and apparently conflict with the report of Raman spectroscopy analyses, which visited points on the map analysed by Pixie in 1985 and confirmed that the Pixie figures were absurdly low. Undaunted, in 2004, Mrs. Olin inspired the involvement of a Danish conservation team who have produced some of the most useless and some of the most useful 21st century work on the Vinland map. The useless work was mostly repetition of claims which had been considered and dismissed in the 1960s, such as their studies of artificial wormholes and modern iron gall inks. The most useful, published in 2017, was the analysis of the chemical which the radiocarbon team had ignored, although even then the Danish team's inadequate knowledge of earlier work made them come to a problematic conclusion about its likely source. Most recently, Mrs. Ollin has involved a Canadian team at the University of Winnipeg in a project to make legible the almost completely bleached out text on the rear end paper of the Historia Tartarorum volume. Perhaps due to her peculiar notions about iron gall ink, which was almost certainly the medium used for this particular document, the team tried every imaginable method to improve the legibility of the writing, except the methods which would have stood a chance of success. However, there's more on that in a minute. In the midst of all these misdirected scientific efforts, a couple of very simple pieces of information found by searching the World Wide Web fell like the proverbial bolt from the blue. John Paul Floyd revealed in 2013 that a suspiciously familiar sounding medieval encyclopedia volume with the Historia Tartarorum as an appendix had once existed in the Zaragoza Cathedral Library plundered by Enzo Ferraioli, and that an inaccurate 18th century engraving of the 1436 Andrea Bianco map, which Lawrence Whitten had identified in the 1950s as the basis for the Old World outline on the Vinland map, was a better match for that outline than the original. The engraved map was available to Skelton and many other researchers with access to good libraries, but I suspect that Whitten, following a Wikispiratorial hint from Ferraioli, specifically promoted the 19th century photographic reproduction of the 1436 map as the obvious version for study, causing experts not to look too closely at the engraving. Those are perhaps the last truly essential pieces of the great puzzle, though Mr. Floyd does provide a rather neat further revelation about the writing on the back of the Vinland map. He has just published his research as a book called A Sorry Saga, and in tidying up loose ends before publication, he followed a source reference in one of my videos to a 1980s ultraviolet light photo of the illegible writing which defeated the Canadian team. He was able to decipher just enough words for another of his famous online searches, and identified the writing as a copy of the ending of a mid-15th century work by Fernand Perez de Guzman about the life and times of King Juan II of Castile. That conveniently paints a picture of the volume's former owner as a person interested in works of the 15th century, with the bleaching and reuse of old paper as a hint of frugality. Having mentioned Mr. Floyd, a clever and thorough researcher, I must now turn to the topic of the anti-experts, people who challenge expertise on specific issues without claiming expertise themselves. The first of the Vinland map anti-experts was Ardell Abrahamson, who proposed, way back in the 1970s, that the annotace in the Vinland map could have come from clay. Kenneth Toe wrote to him explaining why this hypothesis was ludicrous, and was most startled to see it promoted without his response in the 1996 augmented edition of the Yale University Press book, alongside other fanciful suggestions from Abrahamson. The clay meme was perpetuated online by a 21st century anti-expert, Hugh McCulloch, who created a web page listing arguments against all sorts of individual pieces of evidence pointing to forgery, which he kept updating until 2008, then stopped just as things were getting interesting. Even in the past couple of weeks, Hugh has been trying to minimise the coverage of John Paul Floyd's discoveries on Wikipedia, on the not unreasonable grounds that they have not been peer-reviewed. Peer review is something of an elephant in the room in the Vinland Map saga, because, in respect of publications on both sides of the argument, it has been lamentably poor. Journal editors are not immune from the temptations of Wikispiracy when a paper on a hot topic comes their way. In the 21st century, we have publication technology which should be able to overcome such failings. Linking comments directly to a publication and building in author corrections as a current version without actually removing or completely hiding the original version can, with effective moderation, take us far beyond the limitations of simple pre-publication peer review. To sum up, what I have attempted to demonstrate today is that self-interest can motivate the unscrupulous to build upon the efforts of equally unscrupulous precursors, and, worse, that even the less obvious self-interest of the scrupulous, in the form of a very modest desire for status and a corresponding much more forceful desire not to lose status, which provokes a great reluctance to admit mistakes, can be manipulated if they fail to remember the clear guidance given by Michael Faraday all those years ago. The world of knowledge building can, and as other much more significant controversies show, must do better.